in the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists.
He was a simple, honest man who sought to lead life after what he regarded as his own inner lights. That is not to speak of him as a mystic personality. He had a great attachment to truth. And to pursue truth, he would go through a great deal of suffering. And if he departed from truth, he regarded it as imperative that he should make a self-examination and confession of it. That was his method of purification.
There is an indefinable, mysterious power that pervades everything. I feel it, though I do not see it. It is this unseen power which makes itself felt and yet defies all proof, because it is so unlike all that I perceive through my senses. It transcends the senses, but it is possible to reason out the existence of God to a limited extent. Even in ordinary affairs, we know that people do not know who rules or why and how he rules. And yet they know that there is a power that certainly rules. In my tour last year, I met many poor villagers, and I found upon inquiry that they did not know who ruled. They simply said, some God ruled. If the knowledge of these poor people was so limited about their ruler, I, who am infinitely lesser in respect to God than they to their ruler, need not be surprised if I do not realize the presence of God, the King of Kings. Nevertheless, I do feel, as the poor villagers felt, that there is orderliness in the universe. There is an unalterable law governing everything and every being that exists or lives. It is not a blind law, for no blind law can govern the conduct of living beings. It can now be proved that even matter is life. That law, then, which governs all life is God. Law and the lawgiver are one. I may not deny the law or the lawgiver because I know so little about it or him. Just as my denial or ignorance of the existence of an earthly power will avail me nothing, even so my denial of God and his law will not liberate me from its operation, whereas humble and mute acceptance of divine authority makes life's journey easier, even as the acceptance of earthly rules makes life under it easier.
He regards the whole world as manifestation of God. God to him is truth. And he says it is mixed. There is truth and untruth. There is evil and there is good. He does not see anything in which there is not an element of truth.
I do dimly perceive that whilst everything around me is ever changing, ever dying, there is underlying all that change a living power that is changeless, that holds all together, that creates, dissolves, and recreates. That informing power or spirit is God, and since nothing else that I see merely through the senses can or will persist, he alone is. And is this power benevolent or malevolent? I see it as purely benevolent, for I can see that in the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists. Hence I gather that God is life, truth, light. He is love. He is the supreme good.
Gandhiji was a man of no mean intellect. He could argue, he could reason, he could set out a case in all its logical perfection. He could beat argument with argument. But he regarded the intellect, reason, argument as all subordinate, regenerate, incomplete, except in the context of what he called the heart. In his own words, he says,
He is no God who merely satisfies the intellect, if he ever does. God, to be God, must rule the heart and transform it. He must express himself in every smallest act of his votary. This can only be done through a definite realization, more real than the five senses can ever produce. Sense perceptions can be, and often are, false and deceptive, however real they may appear to us. Where there is realization outside the senses, it is infallible. It is proved not by extraneous evidence, but in the transformed conduct and character of those who have felt the real presence of God within. Such testimony is to be found in the experiences of an unbroken line of prophets and sages in all countries and climes. To reject this evidence is to deny oneself. This realization is preceded by an immovable faith. He who would, in his own person, test the fact of God's presence can do so by a living faith. And since faith itself cannot be proved by extraneous evidence, the safest course is to believe in the moral government of the world, and therefore in the supremacy of the moral law, the law of truth and love. Exercise of faith will be the safest where there is a clear determination summarily to reject all that is contrary to truth and love. I confess that I have no argument to convince through reason. Faith transcends reason. All that I can advise is not to attempt the impossible.
and this inspired his conduct, his reaction to other people's conduct, his method, his hopes, and the regulation of his entire behavior. What is greater than the mind, that was fundamental to him. You often heard it said that his gospels were truth and non-violence. Gandhiji knew no fear. He always moved and lived and worked outside the context of fear. I mention this because it's frightfully important, it's extremely important in the world today. He will not seek to modify his means with a view to gaining quicker results. In the words of the Prime Minister,
the great leader of my country, Mahatma Gandhi, under whose inspiration and sheltering care I grew up, always laid stress on moral values and warned us never to subordinate means to ends. We were not worthy of him, and yet to the best of our ability we tried to follow his teaching. Even the limited extent to which we could follow his teaching yielded rich results. After a generation of intense struggle with a great and powerful nation, we achieved success. And perhaps the most significant part of that achievement, for which credit is due to both parties, was the manner of it.
it's only those who desire things passionately, selfishly, and put that above everything else that become violent, because for the achievement of the desire, they outrage their own selves and the selves of other people. His earlier achievement in South Africa now appears as a preface to the greatest achievement of his life, namely the awakening and the liberation of the Indian peoples, and that by the special methods which have now become historic. The outstanding characteristics of the Indian national movement, particularly since Gandhiji's leadership of it, is the reliance on the people. If the Indian national movement, as led by him, had not placed the total reliance on the people, there would have been no movement. There were not the weapons, there was not the money, there was not the force, there was not the organization. It was an article of faith. It's the basic assumption of the Indian liberation movement, where the power and the faith and the strength lay in the people themselves. Gandhiji's approach can only be really learned by the study of that movement as a whole. On his way back from England in 1931, he stopped at Switzerland for a moment. I think it's appropriate and perhaps useful to draw your attention to a few words he said himself.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace. I know the value of discipline and truth. I must ask you to believe me when I say that I have never made a statement of this description, that the masses of India, if it became necessary, would resort to violence. I regard myself as incapable in my lucid moments of making a statement of this character. It is complete independence that we want.
He was sometimes jeered, sometimes laughed at, sometimes criticized by his friends and admonished by his enemies, but he never faltered. He did not allow the element of hate to creep into it. There is no instance in history where a great national struggle for independence against a conquering force has resulted in a fraternity of relationship afterwards. In the words of the Prime Minister, which you will now hear,
history hardly affords a parallel to a solution of such a conflict in a peaceful way, followed by friendly and cooperative relations. It is astonishing how rapidly bitterness and ill will between the two nations have faded away, giving place to cooperation. And we in India have decided of our own free will to continue this cooperation as an independent nation. I would not presume to offer advice to other and more experienced nations in any way. But may I suggest for your consideration that there is some lesson in India's peaceful revolution which might be applied to the larger problems before the world today. That revolution demonstrated to us that physical force need not necessarily be the arbiter of man's destiny, and that the method of waging a struggle and the way of its termination are of paramount importance. Past history shows us the important part that physical force has played. But it also shows us that no such force can ultimately ignore the moral forces of the world, and if it attempts to do so, it does so at its peril. Today, this problem faces us in all its intensity because the weapons that physical force has at its disposal are terrible to contemplate. Must the 20th century differ from primitive barbarism only in the destructive efficacy of the weapons that man's ingenuity has invented for man's destruction? I do believe, in accordance with my master's teaching, that there is another way to meet this situation and solve the problem that faces us.
Da-la-la, da-la, da-la-la.
In the spring of 1947, there gathered at Delhi representatives, not government representatives, representatives of the peoples of the great Asian nations. It was not a political conference. It was not a conference of exclusive Pan-Asianism. This Asian conference was presided over by an Indian woman, the late Srimati Sarojini Naidu, who at the time of her death was the governor of one of our great states, Uttar Pradesh in India. Mrs. Sarojini Naidu is a poet of remarkable distinction and affected the life of India for nearly half a century. She was a close disciple of Gandhiji, suffered imprisonment several times during the liberation movement, a woman of vast knowledge and erudition, but much more with a great sense of humor and affection and compassion for everybody around her.
I am going to request the father of our nation, the apostle of love and truth and non-violence, to give us his benediction.
Madam President and friends, I do not think that I should apologize to you for having to speak in a foreign tongue. I wonder if this loudspeaker carries my voice to the farthest end of this vast audience. Wisdom came to the West from the East. And who are these wise men? Zoroaster. He belonged to the East. He was followed by Buddha. He belonged to the East. He belonged to India. Who followed Buddha? Jesus, again from Asia. Then what happened? Christianity became disfigured when it went to the West. I'm sorry to have to say that, but that is my view. Before Jesus was Musa, Moses, also belonging to Palestine. Certainly, the carnage that is going on before your very eyes, sorry, shameful. As I said yesterday, you have to bury it here. Don't carry the memory of that carnage beyond the confines of India. What I want you to understand, if you can, that the message of the East, the message of Asia is not to be learned through European spectacles, through the Western spectacles, not by imitating the tinsel of the West, the gunpowder of the West, the atom bomb of the West. If you want to give a message again to the West, it must be a message of love. It must be a message of truth. There must be a conquest. Please, that will interfere with my speech and that will interfere with your understanding also. I want to capture your hearts and don't want to receive your claps. Let your hearts clap in unison with what I am saying, and I think I shall have finished my work. Therefore, I want you to go away with the thought that Asia has to conquer the West. A friend asked yesterday, did I believe in one world? Of course I believe in one world. And how can I possibly do otherwise when I become an inheritor of the message of love that these great unconquerable teachers left for us. You can redeliver that message now in this age of democracy, in the age of awakening of the poorest of the poor. You can redeliver this message with the greatest emphasis. Then you will complete the conquest of the whole of the West, not through vengeance, because you have been exploited. And in the exploitation, of course, I want to include Africa.
He addressed himself to the social inequalities and evils at home, for social equality among our own people, for the abolition of untouchability, for the equal position of women in our society, and for the rights of the laboring classes.
If you really want to see India, you have to find it in a Bhangi cottage, in a humble Bhangi home of such villages. So the English historians teach us are 700,000. See a few villages of India, then you will find real India. Today, I will make this admission also, that you will not be fascinated by the sight. You will have then to scratch down below the dung heaps that the villages are today. I don't pretend to say that they were ever places of paradise, but today they are really dung heaps. They were not like that before, of that I am quite sure. But that I speak not from history, but from what I have seen myself with my physical eyes of India, and I have traveled from one end of India to the other, seen these villages, seen the miserable specimens of humanity.
Violence breeds violence. Hatred breeds hatred. It's therefore interesting to listen to the observations of one of the greatest scientists of our time, Albert Einstein.
I believe that Gandhi's views were the most enlightened of all the political men in our time. We should strive to do things in his spirit, not to use violence in fighting for our cause, but by non-participation in anything you believe is evil.
Gandhiji taught us one thing, and that is possible for one man to do much, especially if he devotes himself, is fired with the belief that his duty, his obligation, his capacity, that is his concern, the rest follows.
Put your hearts together, not merely your heads, but hearts together, and understand the secret of the messages of all these wise men of the East has left to us. You will easily understand that the conquest of the West will be completed, and that conquest will be loved by the West itself. West today is despairing of multiplication of atom bombs, because a multiplication of atom bombs means utter destruction, not merely of the West, but it will be a destruction of the world, as if the prophecy of the Bible is going to be fulfilled, and there is to be a perfect deluge. Heaven forbid that there will be that deluge. And through man's wrong against himself, it is up to you to deliver the whole world, not merely Asia, but deliver the whole world from that wickedness, from that sin. That is the precious heritage your teachers, my teachers, have left to us.
Independence came. Power was transferred to the Indian people on the 15th of August, 1947. But Gandhiji's work was not finished. Now he turned his attention, his entire energy, to bringing about communal harmony in India. He marched barefooted, unarmed, into the troublesome spot of eastern India to prevent violence between eastern Bengal, which had now become part of Pakistan, and of India itself. Hindu-Muslim friction was rife. India was independent. Gandhiji embarked on his last fast in the middle of January 1948 as an act of self-purification. It was his way of penance for his people. It was his inward looking. With that inward looking, the greater part of India looked inward. And in a few days' time, the leaders of all the communities signed an agreement and produced it before him, which enabled him to break his fast. A few weeks later, on the 30th of January, the time when he was addressing his last prayer meeting, his mortal life came to an end, stricken down by the hand of an assassin, one of our own countrymen. Out of India passed a great life and a great light.
This is the All India Radio. Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru.
Friends and comrades, the light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere. And I do not quite know what to tell you and how to say it. Our beloved leader, Bapu as we called him, the father of the nation, is no more.
To all the world belongs the legacy of his life, but to India a vast responsibility. It would not be inappropriate to remind ourselves of his words of India's responsibility in regard to the world. Here is what Gandhiji said.
I feel in the innermost recesses of my heart, after a political experience extending over an unbroken period of close upon 30 years, that the world is sick unto death of blood spilling. The world is seeking a way out, and I flatter myself with the belief that perhaps it will be the privilege of the ancient land of India to show that way out to the hungering world.